Okay, we have covered intentional torts and we have covered negligence torts, but there is a third category of torts that you may or may not have ever heard of, and that is strict liability torts. There are certain activities, if you engage in these activities, the law says if someone gets hurt because you're doing one of these things, we don't care how careful or how careless you were. We don't even look to see how careful or how careless you were. You just have to pay for the damages, the injury, and under a theory of strict liability. So what are the three types of activities that if you're involved in one of these, you are held liable under a theory of strict liability rather than negligence? The first one is engaging in abnormally dangerous activities. So if you're the guy that works with dynamite and blows stuff up, you blow up mountainsides for new highways, you blow up those buildings that they implode in the middle of a city so they can build a new building. If you're the guy that makes your living blowing stuff up, you better have good insurance, because if somebody gets hurt when you blow something up, you just have to pay under a theory of strict liability. We don't look to see how careful or how careless you were. You just have to pay. So abnormally dangerous activities is the first one. The second one is keeping dangerous wild animals as pets. If you have a puppy dog as a pet in your backyard and the neighbor boy teases it through the fence and he gets bit, you may or may not have liability for the dog bite. But if you have a pet Bengal tiger in your backyard and it gets loose and eats the neighbor kid, you have to pay in a theory of strict liability, because it's not safe or reasonable for you to keep a dangerous wild animal as a pet in your backyard. So the first two, abnormally dangerous activities and keeping dangerous wild animals as pets, those are based on a theory of you created an unreasonably high level of danger. But the third and final area of strict liability is not based on the creation of danger, it's based on distribution of the risk. The third area of strict liability is products liability. If you manufacture or sell a product and someone uses that product for its intended purpose, so they buy a can of beans and they eat the beans, they don't throw the can and hit somebody in the head with it, and if it causes an injury, then you have to pay under a theory of strict liability. We don't care how careful or how careless you were in manufacturing that product. You just have to pay under a theory of products liability. And the theory there is not that you created a extraordinary danger like the other two. The theory is simply that when a guy makes money selling a product, let's require him to add 1/10 of 1 cent to each one of those products to use that money to buy a good policy of liability insurance, so that if 1 million people buy 1 million cans of beans, and out of those 1 million people, 999,999 just have a good can of beans and enjoy dinner, but the one out of 1 million that gets a poison can of beans, there's a good fund of insurance money there available to pay for his medical bills, and that was paid in part by everybody paying a part of the purchase price for a good liability insurance policy. So the three areas of strict liability are abnormally dangerous activities, keeping dangerous wild animals as pets, and the third one is products liability. Now before we leave that, you've got to hear the story, the famous story about Jerry Spence, and I can never remember this gal's name. I swore last time I was going to have it written down and I forgot it again, but there's a famous case involving a woman that was an employee at a nuclear power plant. They made a movie about this, and she wanted to form a labor union within the power plant, and one of the reasons she wanted to form the union was because the safety practices in the nuclear power plant were so lax that employees within the power plant were playing catch with cakes of yellow uranium. They're throwing it back and forth. Many people believe that the origin of the cartoon beginning of the Simpsons cartoon, where the nuclear material falls out of the power plant, rolls down the street, They believe that's based upon this famous case. Oh, her name is Carol something or other. But anyway, she's trying to form a union, and the government and the electric company, they don't want a union in there, so there's a lot of bad blood going back and forth. And in the middle of her attempt to form a union in the power plant, some nuclear material somehow gets out of the power plant and into her apartment and into her food in her refrigerator and into her body, and she develops a fatal cancer because of exposure to radiation. So there are many liberal people, pro-union people, that decide that this is some kind of government conspiracy to stop the union, and liberal lawyers show up from out of the woodwork to come and sue on behalf of this woman that's been given this fatal disease by this radioactive material. And they got all these wild conspiracy theories, and they go to court with this thing, and they can't prove any of their conspiracy theories, and so the jury is obviously turning against them, and they are losing the case. Well, there's a world famous trial lawyer up in Wyoming by the name of Jerry Spence. He's written a number of books. One of my favorites is called Gunning for Justice, and he writes about this case in that book. But he didn't have anything to do with the case originally, but they called him up. One of his friends was working on it, called him up and said, "Jerry, we got this disaster down here. We're part way through this trial. We're obviously losing. We don't know what to do. Will you come down and help us?" And he said, "No, I don't want anything to do with that." And he said, "Well, will you at least come down on a weekend and look at the files and tell us what you think?" And he said, "All right, I'll come down." So he comes down, he looks through all the files, and he says, "You guys are right, you're going to lose." He says, "I could win this case, but you would have to trust me. You'd have to turn the whole case over to me, and the rest of you guys get out of it." And they said, "Well, we're losing the case anyway. We'll give the case to you." So the trial goes on, and on one side there's 9 lawyers in gray suits representing the nuclear power plant and the electric company, and on this side there's one guy, Jerry Spence, with his cowboy hat and his leather fringe jacket from Wyoming. And the trial goes on, and in the end Jerry Spence wins the trial, and he gets what was at that time one of the largest civil jury awards ever awarded. It was something like $90 million. It was later reduced on a little bit on appeal, but he gets an award of $90 million. How does he do that? He gets it in his closing argument. He says, "Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I know you've been presented with a lot of wild and confusing information here about allegations of conspiracies and whether or not the government went after this woman because of the attempt to form a union." He says, "And frankly, I don't know how much of that you can believe, but I know you can understand this." He says, "There's a principle of law. It's not directly applicable here, but I think it's a great analogy. There's a principle in the law that says if you keep a dangerous wild animal for a pet, and the pet gets loose and causes injury, the law holds you strictly liable. We don't care how careful or how careless you were. You let that dangerous wild animal get loose, and so you have to pay for whatever damage the wild animal does. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I submit to you that the power plant, the nuclear power plant, the electric company, and the government had a dangerous wild animal that they were keeping as a pet. They had nuclear material, and somehow that nuclear material, that dangerous wild animal, got loose, and now my client is going to die. And so under a theory of strict liability, they should have to pay for that, regardless of whether there was any conspiracy or any other stuff. They let the dangerous wild animal get loose, it hurt somebody, they should have to pay." And Jerry Spence won a $90 million verdict on that. So you see, these lessons that I teach you, you never know when they may turn around and get you $90 million. So you better keep coming to class and paying attention.